This is the story of the garden keeper, a quiet caretaker named Mrs. Blossom, who tends to a vast, endless garden with calm, careful attention. This garden stretches out as far as the eye can see, filled with neat rows of flowers, tall hedges, winding stone paths, and quiet groves of trees that sway gently in the breeze. The sunlight filters softly through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Birds sing softly from high branches, and the gentle hum of bees can be heard drifting through the blossoms. There's no rush here, no excitement, no surprises, just the quiet, steady life of the garden and its gentle keeper. Her days are slow, her routines are simple, and the garden is always calm. So, find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and close your eyes if you like. I'm going to take you through the garden keeper's week, one day at a time. Everything is calm, everything is peaceful, and everything is just as it should be. The morning sun crept slowly over the tops of the garden walls, stretching its soft, warm light across the winding stone paths and neat rows of flowers. The air was cool and still, carrying the light scent of lavender and wild roses. Tiny drops of dew sparkled on the leaves and petals, catching the sunlight and shimmering gently before slipping away. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her little stone cottage at exactly the same time she did every morning. She wore a soft blue coat with big wooden buttons, neatly fastened from her collar down to her knees. Her hair, silver and tied back into a simple braid, was tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shielded her eyes from the morning sun. Her hands were gloved in soft leather, and her shoes, though worn from years of walking the same garden paths, were polished and neat. She made her way along the winding path to the old stone shed at the edge of the garden. Its wooden door creaked gently as she pulled it open, revealing rows of neatly hung tools, watering cans, shears, spades, and rakes, all polished and lined up perfectly. She reached for her favourite watering can, a large green one with a long spout and a smooth wooden handle. She held it gently, brushing her gloved hands over its surface before carrying it outside. The iron faucet stood just beside the shed, its surface cool with the morning air. Mrs. Blossom turned the handle slowly, and water splashed out, filling the can with a steady, bubbling hum. She watched as the water swirled and settled, tiny ripples dancing across the surface. When it was full, she turned off the faucet, lifted the watering can by its handle, and began her walk down the path. Mrs. Blossom always started with the roses. They grew tall and bright along the western edge of the garden, their petals curled softly with the morning dew. Red, pink, white and yellow blossoms stretched up towards the sunlight, their leaves fresh and green. She stepped carefully between the rows, lifting the watering can with gentle hands. She tipped the spout slowly, watching as the water poured rose to rose, her hand steady as she watered each one. She paused at every plant, running her fingers lightly over the petals, brushing away stray bits of dust and checking each leaf for signs of wilting. Her movements were calm and repetitive, her hands gentle and slow. She never rushed. She simply moved from one rose to the next, tipping the spout, watching the water spread out, and nodding to herself when the soil looked just right. The sunlight stretched longer across the path as she worked, the birds chirping softly from the branches above. When she finished with the roses, she stepped back, took a deep breath, and admired her work. The petals glistened softly in the light, the leaves bright and clean, the roots freshly watered. Everything looked just as it should. Mrs. Blossom carried the watering can back to the faucet, filling it once more with the same slow turn of the handle. She watched as the water bubbled up, swirling gently before settling. When it was full, she lifted it again, brushing a bit of dust from her gloves before walking back to the path. The wild flowers grew along the eastern side of the garden, patches of colour that spread out beneath the tall trees. Buttercups, daisies, and bluebells swayed gently in the breeze, their petals bright and soft. Mrs. Blossom knelt carefully beside them, her knees pressing into the grass, and began to water each patch with the same steady rhythm. She moved her hand slowly, letting the water trickle out in thin streams, soaking into the soil, spreading out beneath the roots. She would pause after each patch, brushing her hand over the tops of the flowers, feeling the softness of the petals, the coolness of the leaves. She would nod once, straighten her hat, and move on to the next patch. The lilies came last, their tall white petals gleaming in the sunlight. Mrs. Blossom watered each one carefully, tipping the spout with perfect precision. The water streamed out smoothly, darkening the soil, pooling softly before disappearing into the earth. She brushed her hand over each petal, smoothing out any creases, straightening the stems where needed. When all the flowers had been watered, Mrs. Blossom carried the watering can back to the shed, placed it neatly on its hook, and dusted off her gloves. She stood for a moment in the doorway, looking out over the garden, watching the sunlight stretch across the paths, catching the edges of the leaves, making the petals glisten. The garden was still and quiet. The flowers were watered, their petals clean and bright. Everything was just as it should be. Mrs. Blossom nodded to herself, brushed a stray leaf from her coat, and walked back to her cottage, her shoes tapping softly against the stone path. The sunlight drifted lazily over the garden, dust motes floated gently in the air, and the leaves rustled softly in the breeze. Everything was calm, everything was peaceful. Tuesday mornings began with the soft glow of sunlight spilling through the leaves stood tall and neat, their leaves bright and green, stretching out in perfect lines along the winding paths. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her cottage at the same time she always did, her soft blue coat buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat resting gently on her silver hair. Her hands were gloved in soft leather, and she walked with calm, even steps to the old stone shed at the edge of the garden. She opened the creaking door, and inside, everything was just as she had left it, neat and orderly. Watering cans hung on the far wall, lined up perfectly, their metal sides polished and clean. Wooden-handled rakes and shovels leaned in the corner, their handles smooth from years of gentle use. On the back wall, hung carefully on iron hooks, rested her pruning shears. They were sharp and well kept, their handles wrapped in leather that had softened with time. Mrs. Blossom reached up, took them gently from their hook, and inspected the blades. She always did this, running her gloved hand along the edge, making sure they were clean and ready. She brushed off a small speck of dust, nodded with quiet satisfaction, and stepped back outside. The hedges were tall and thick, their leaves glossy and green. They stretched out in long, even lines along the stone paths, some forming perfect squares around flower beds, others standing straight and tall along the edges of the garden. Mrs. Blossom began at the northern corner, where the hedges grew tallest and the light was soft and cool. She stepped up to the first hedge, adjusted her hat, and lifted the pruning shears. Her hands moved slowly, the blades closing with a gentle snip each time they met a stray branch. She trimmed carefully, snipping away the smallest imperfections, evening out the edges until they were smooth and straight. Mrs. Blossom worked with calm attention, her hands steady and unhurried. She would step back now and then, tilt her head to the side and inspect her work. If she saw even the slightest leaf out of place, she would step forward again, lift the shears, and snip it away. The sunlight grew warmer as she moved down the path, stretching across the hedges and casting long, soft shadows. Birds chirped quietly from the high branches, their songs blending with the gentle snipping of her shears. Snip, snip, snip. The sound was soft and rhythmic, blending with the stillness of the garden. When she finished the first row, she would pause, brush the stray leaves into a wicker basket she carried with her, and move to the next hedge. Her movements were smooth and practiced, her hands steady and gentle. The blades of the shears would open and close, trimming each branch with perfect care. As Mrs. Blossom trimmed, the small clippings would gather at her feet, soft green leaves that fluttered down and settled gently on the stones. She would reach down every few minutes, her gloved hands brushing the leaves into small piles before collecting them in the wicker basket. The basket was light and well worn, its edges frayed from years of use. She would lift it carefully, cradling it in her arms, and continue on to the next row of hedges. The path stretched out in smooth, winding lines, bordered on each side by bright patches of flowers and trimmed grass. The sunlight drifted along the path, casting soft glows on the stones as she walked. Mrs. Blossom would work her way down each path, trimming the hedges, brushing the leaves into the basket, and moving on to the next. Her hands were steady, her eyes calm and patient. There was never a rush, never a hurry, only the slow, careful work of keeping each hedge neat and even. When she finished the last row, she stepped back and admired her work. The hedges were tall and straight, their edges smooth and perfectly trimmed. She nodded once, a small smile on her face, and carried the wicker basket back to the compost pile near the edge of the garden. She emptied it carefully, watching as the clippings tumbled out, settling gently on top of the leaves from the week before. She brushed her hands off, straightened her gloves, and made her way back to the shed. Mrs. Blossom placed the shears back on their iron hook, brushed a bit of dust from her coat, and closed the door with a soft click. She stood for a moment, looking out over the garden, watching the sunlight filter through the branches, catching on the polished stone paths. Everything was calm, everything was neat, everything was just as it should be. Wednesday mornings began just like all the others, with the soft glow of sunlight spilling over the tops of the hedges and stretching out along the stone paths. The morning air was cool and still, carrying with it the soft scent of lavender and fresh grass. The stones glimmered with a thin layer of dew, sparkling gently as the light reached them. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her cottage, her blue coat buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied securely beneath her chin. Her gloved hands were folded gently in front of her as she walked the familiar path to the old stone shed. The door creaked as she pulled it open, and inside, everything was just as it should be, neat, orderly, and perfectly arranged. She reached for the broom that hung on the far wall, its wooden handle polished and smooth from years of use. The bristles were firm but soft, bound tightly, and kept clean after every sweeping. She ran her hand over the handle, feeling the coolness of the wood, the familiar weight of it in her hands. With a soft nod of approval, she stepped back outside and began her work. Mrs. Blossom always began with the main path that stretched from her cottage to the centre of the garden. It was wide and smooth, the stones laid out in perfect lines, stretching beneath archways of ivy and climbing roses. The sunlight spilled over the tops of the arches, casting soft shadows along the path. She set the broom down gently, holding it with both hands settled there. The sunlight crept along with her, stretching farther across the stones as the morning drifted by. Birds chirped softly from the branches above, their songs blending with the gentle sound of the broom as it moved over the path. Swish, swish, swish. When the main path was finished, Mrs. Blossom moved onto the smaller paths that wound around the flower beds and beneath the archways. Vines of ivy curled gently over the wooden arches, their leaves soft and green, swaying just slightly in the morning breeze. Mrs. Blossom swept slowly, her hands guiding the broom with steady care. The bristles brushed softly over the stones, gathering tiny petals that had drifted down from the roses above. She moved with calm attention, her footsteps gentle and unhurried. She would pause every now and then to straighten a vine or brush a bit of dust from the edge of the arch. Yes, flower beds were lined with smooth, rounded stones, each one placed carefully in perfect lines. She would sweep along their edges, brushing away bits of soil and stray leaves, making sure everything was neat and tidy. Her hands moved in the same slow rhythm, back and forth, the sound soft and comforting. When all the paths were clear, Mrs. Blossom gathered up the piles of leaves and petals, brushing them gently into her wicker basket. She carried it with slow, steady steps to the compost pile near the garden's edge. There, she would empty it carefully, watching as the leaves tumbled out, settling quietly on top of the earth. She would brush her gloves together, dusting off bits of soil, and turn back to look at her work. The stone paths stretched out neatly, perfectly swept and polished, with not a single leaf or petal left behind. The sunlight spilled over the garden, making the stones shine softly, casting long, gentle shadows on the ground. Mrs. Blossom walked back to the shed, opened the door, and hung the broom carefully back on its hook. She dusted off her gloves, smoothed her coat, and stepped back outside. For a moment, she stood quietly, looking out over the garden, watching as the breeze stirred the leaves and the sunlight glimmered softly on the flowers. Everything was calm, everything was still, everything was exactly as it should be. Thursday mornings always began the same way. The sunlight would stretch out over the tops of the hedges, spilling across the stone paths in long, soft lines. The flowers would stand, tall and still, their petals freshly dusted with morning dew, shimmering slightly in the gentle breeze. Birds chirped quietly from the high branches, their songs drifting softly through the garden. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her little stone cottage at exactly the same time she did every morning. Her soft blue coat was buttoned neatly, and her austere, wide-brimmed hat shaded her eyes from the morning light. Her hair, silver and neatly braided, rested gently on her shoulder, and her hands were gloved in smooth leather. She walked the familiar path old stone shed, her footsteps soft against the cobblestones. She opened the creaking door, and inside, everything was exactly as it always was, neat, orderly, and perfectly arranged. Rakes, watering cans, shears, and brooms hung carefully along the walls, each one clean and ready for use. She reached for her favourite hand trowel, its wooden handle worn smooth from years of gentle care. The blade was polished and sharp, free of rust or wear. She ran her gloved hand over its surface, brushing off a small bit of dust before turning and stepping back outside. Mrs. Blossom always began with the flower beds along the eastern path. They were lined with stones, smooth and perfectly round, placed with careful precision to hold the soil neatly in place. Rows of tulips, daisies, and marigolds stretched out beneath the low-hanging branches of willow trees. Their petals were bright and soft, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. She knelt carefully at the edge of the flower bed, her knees pressing gently into the grass. She reached into the basket she had brought with her, pulling out a folded cloth which she laid neatly beside her. Then, with slow, practised movements, she pressed the blade of the trowel into the soil, turning it carefully, loosening the earth around the base of the first weed. The weed was small and thin, its roots tangled gently in the soft soil. Mrs. Blossom gripped it carefully, pulling it up with even, steady pressure. The roots came free with a soft whisper, leaving behind a neat little hole in the soil. She brushed away the loose dirt, placed the weed into her basket, and smoothed the soil back over with her hand. Her movements were slow and careful, her hands gentle and practised. She would inspect each flower bed, working her way down the row, searching for stray weeds and bits of stray grass. She would lean forward, her hat shielding her eyes from the light, and pull each weed with the same calm attention. The soil was cool and soft beneath her fingers, crumbling gently as she sifted through it. She would pat it down after each weed was pulled, pressing it neatly back into place, smoothing the edges so the flower bed remained even and tidy. The sunlight drifted across her hands, catching on the edge of the trowel, casting small shadows over the petals of the flowers. When the eastern path was complete, Mrs. Blossom stood slowly, brushing the soil from her gloves. She lifted the wicker basket in her hands, straightened her coat, and walked calmly to the western path where the rose beds waited. The roses were tall and elegant, their petals bright and smooth. Mrs. Blossom knelt beside them, setting the basket gently on the stone path. Her hands moved carefully, As the sunlight crept further across the garden, the birds continued to chirp from their branches. The bees drifted lazily from blossom to blossom, and the breeze whispered softly through the leaves. Mrs. Blossom moved perfectly, her hands steady and patient, her eyes focused and clear. When the flower beds were finally free of weeds, Mrs. Blossom stood up slowly, brushing the soil from her gloves. She picked up the wicker basket, now full of tiny roots and leaves, and carried it with steady steps to the compost pile behind the old oak tree. She emptied it carefully, watching as the weeds tumbled out and settled softly on the earth. She dusted off her gloves, straightened her hat, and walked back to the shed. The trowel was hung back in its proper place. The door was closed with a gentle click, and everything was as it should be. Mrs. Blossom took a moment to look over her garden. The flower beds stretched out in perfect rows, the petals bright and clean, the soil smooth and neat. The sunlight spilled over the tops of the hedges, casting long, gentle shadows along the paths. Friday mornings always began with the sunlight filtering through the branches of the tall oak trees that lined the main path. The light stretched in long, soft beams, casting gentle patterns on the polished stones and the neatly trimmed edges. The leaves rustled gently in the morning breeze, whispering quietly as they swayed back and forth. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her cottage at the same time she did every morning. Her blue coat was buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat rested securely atop her head, and her hands were gloved in soft leather. Her footsteps were slow and even as she walked the familiar path to the old stone shed. She pulled the creaking door open and stepped inside, pausing for a moment to admire the perfect order of the tools inside. The pruning shears she needed hung carefully from an iron hook on the far wall. They were polished and clean, their blades sharp and smooth, their handles wrapped in soft leather. Mrs. Blossom took them gently from the hook, turning them over in her hands, inspecting the edges as she always did. Satisfied, she nodded to herself, closed the shed door with a soft click, and stepped back outside. Mrs. Blossom always began with the oak trees along the main path. They were tall and strong, their branches stretching out over the garden like long, sweeping arms. Their leaves were thick and green, whispering gently as the wind passed through them. Mrs. Blossom stood beneath the first tree, adjusted her hat, and raised the pruning shears. Her hands moved slowly and carefully, snipping away the smallest branches, trimming the edges where the leaves had grown too thick. Her movements were steady and calm, the blades of the shears clicking softly with each cut. Snip, snip, snip. The branches would fall softly to the ground, landing with the lightest whisper on the grass. Mrs. Blossom would pause every few minutes to gather them up, placing them neatly in the wicker basket she had brought with her. She would brush brush off her gloves, nod with satisfaction, and move on to the next branch. The sunlight crept along the path as she worked, stretching out in long lines that glowed softly over the stones. The air was cool and still, and the leaves rustled gently above her, catching the light as they swayed. Birds chirped quietly from their branches, their songs blending with the soft snip, snip of the shears. After the oaks were neatly trimmed, Mrs. Blossom carried her basket carefully to the willow grove at the far end of the garden. The willows stood tall and graceful, their branches reaching down to brush the tops of the flowers that grew beneath them. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting soft shadows on the stone path. Mrs. Blossom knelt beside the first tree, setting her basket down gently. She lifted the shears and began to trim, her hands moving slowly, her eyes drifting over each branch. She would cut away only the smallest bits, just enough to keep the shape neat and tidy. Her hands were steady, her movements smooth and unhurried. Snip, snip, snip. The branches fell softly to the ground, landing in quiet little piles. Mrs. Blossom would pause, collect them with gentle hands, and place them carefully into the basket. She would brush off her gloves, smooth her coat, and move to the next tree. The sunlight drifted lazily through the leaves, catching on the edges of the branches, making them glimmer in the light. The willows swayed gently as she worked, their long branches whispering as the wind brushed through them. Mrs. Blossom continued her trimming, the shears clicking softly in the quiet air, the leaves falling gently into her waiting hands. When all the trees were trimmed and neat, Mrs. Blossom stood back, brushing her hands gently against her coat. She lifted the wicker basket, now filled with tiny branches and leaves, and walked carefully back to the compost pile near the garden's edge. She emptied it slowly, watching as the trimmings tumbled out and settled softly onto the earth. She dusted off her gloves, straightened her hat, and walked back to the stone shed. The shears were hung neatly back on their hook. The shed door closed with a quiet click. Mrs. Blossom stood for a moment, looking out over her garden, watching the way the sunlight touched the tops of the trees, the leaves swaying gently in the soft breeze. Saturday mornings began with the soft hum of bird song drifting through the branches of the tall trees that lined the garden paths. The sunlight crept slowly over the tops of the hedges, stretching out across the grassy lawns that rolled out like green waves between the flower beds and winding stone paths. The grass glimmered with morning dew, each blade catching the light and shimmering softly in the gentle breeze. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her cottage at exactly the same time she did every morning. Her soft blue coat was buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied gently beneath her chin, and her hands were gloved in smooth leather. She walked calmly along the familiar shed, her footsteps soft against the cobblestones. The door creaked as she pulled it open, and inside, everything was exactly as it should be. The tools were lined up perfectly, each one hanging neatly on its hook. The broom, the rake, the shears, all in their proper place. Against the far wall sat her old push mower, its handle polished from years of use, its wheels smooth and well kept. Mrs. Blossom stepped forward, brushing her hand gently over the handle, feeling the coolness of the metal. She gave it a small push, and the wheels turned smoothly, rolling forward with a soft, steady hum. She nodded with satisfaction, rolled it carefully out of the shed, and closed the door with a quiet click. Mrs. Blossom always began with the main lawn that stretched out in front of her cottage. It was wide and perfectly flat, bordered by hedges trimmed neatly the day before. She positioned the mower at the very edge, adjusted her hat, and began her work. The mower moved with a soft, rhythmic whir, its blade slicing through the grass with gentle precision. Mrs. Blossom pushed it slowly and steadily, her hands firm on the handle, her footsteps measured and even. The grass parted neatly beneath the mower, leaving a smooth, even line in its wake. She walked in straight, perfect rows, her movements calm and steady, her eyes drifting down to watch each blade of grass disappear beneath the whirling blades. The sunlight caught on the freshly trimmed grass, making it shine with a soft emerald glow. When she reached the end of the row, she paused, adjusted her hat, and turned the mower slowly, setting it back in place for the next pass. She moved back down the line with the same careful attention, the same gentle rhythm, her hands never rushing, her steps always soft. Once the main lawn was done, Mrs. Blossom moved to the smaller patches of grass that bordered the winding stone paths. The grass grew a little thicker here, curling gently around the edges of flower beds and stretching out beneath the branches of low-hanging willow trees. She guided the mower carefully around the corners, her hands steady and smooth. The blades hummed quietly, trimming the grass with perfect precision. She would pause every now and then to pick up a stray leaf or brush away a bit of dust from the mower's handle. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her eyes calm and watchful. The mower left perfect lines behind her, the grass lying flat and even, stretching out in smooth patterns. She worked her way around each curve, each corner, making sure not a single blade was missed. The sunlight drifted through the branches, casting soft patterns on the ground as she moved. When all the lawns were neatly trimmed, Mrs. Blossom guided the mower back to the stone shed. She dusted off the handle, wiped the wheels with a soft cloth she kept in her pocket, and rolled it carefully back into its place. She stepped back, brushed off her gloves, and closed the door with a gentle click. For a grass smooth and even, the sunlight spilling gently over the tops of the hedges. The birds continued their songs from the branches above, and the breeze whispered softly through the flowers. Sunday mornings began quietly, with the soft light of dawn stretching across the garden paths, spilling over the hedges and glimmering on the dew-soaked grass. The air was cool and still, carrying with it the soft scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. Birds chirped softly from the branches above, their songs gentle and unhurried. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her little stone cottage at exactly the same time she always did. Her blue coat was buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied beneath. Her chin and her hands were gloved in smooth leather. She walked the familiar path to the old stone shed, her footsteps soft against the cobblestones. The door creaked as she pulled it open, and inside everything was just as it should be, neatly arranged and perfectly in place. The watering cans hung from iron hooks, the brooms and rakes were lined up against the far wall, and her wicker basket sat quietly in its corner, empty and waiting. Mrs. Blossom reached for the feather duster that hung beside the watering cans. It was soft and light, its feathers smooth and perfectly clean. She held it carefully, brushing a hand along the edge, before stepping back outside and closing the door with a gentle click. The first task of every Sunday was dusting the statues and bird baths that dotted the garden. They were made of smooth, white stone, their surfaces polished and cool to the touch. Some were nestled between rows of flowers, others tucked away beneath shady trees. Mrs. Blossom began with the marble statue of the gardener that stood at the entrance to the rose beds. It was tall and graceful, with vines of ivy curling gently around its base. She lifted the feather duster and began her work, moving the soft blooms back and forth, brushing away the thin layer of dust that had settled over the week. The dust floated gently into the air, catching the sunlight before drifting back down. She moved slowly and deliberately, her hands calm and steady. She brushed along the folds of the statue's coat, the brim of its hat, and the handles of the stone shears it held. Her movements were smooth and unhurried, the duster gliding over the surface in perfect rhythm. When she finished with the statue, she moved to the bird baths. The water inside was still and clear, reflecting the sky above. Mrs. Blossom dipped her hand in, brushing away tiny leaves that had settled at the surface. She dusted the edges with slow, careful strokes, her hand gliding over the stone rim, brushing away the finest layer of pollen and soil. Once the statues and bird baths were clean, Mrs. Blossom returned to the shed, hung up the feather duster, and reached for her broom. It was sturdy and well kept, its handle smooth and polished from years of use. She lifted it carefully, holding it with both hands and one step at a time, her hands gliding smoothly back and forth. The sunlight drifted lazily along the path as she worked, stretching out in long lines, catching the edges of the leaves as they spiraled slowly to the ground. Mrs. Blossom continued like this, sweeping gently, pausing every now and then to collect the piles of leaves and brush them into her wicker basket. She would wipe her hands off, adjust her hat, and move on to the next stretch of path. Her footsteps were soft, her hands calm and measured. When the paths were clean and clear, Mrs. Blossom reached into the shed one last time, pulling out a small burlap sack of birdseed. She walked slowly to each bird feeder that hung from the low branches, pouring the seed gently into each one, smoothing the edges with her gloved hand. The birds would come later, soft flutters of wings and gentle chirps that would fill the garden with calm sound. Finally, she filled her favourite watering can and walked the length of the flower beds, her hands steady as she tipped the spout, watching the water pour out in smooth, even streams. The soil darkened beneath the gentle trickle, soaking up the water slowly and deeply. She moved from row to row, taking her time, never rushing, always careful. When everything was done, Mrs. Blossom returned her tools to their hooks, closed the shed door with a soft click, and stood quietly in the sunlight. She looked out her garden, watching the breeze drift through the flowers, the leaves rustling gently in the trees. The paths were clear, the statues were dusted, the bird baths were clean, and the flowers were watered. Spring came slowly to the garden keeper's world. The air grew warmer, the sunlight stretched longer, and the first soft rains began to fall. It would start with just a light tapping against the leaves, tiny droplets bouncing gently off the petals of the roses and pooling softly in the bird baths. Mrs. Blossom would step out of her cottage in the early morning light, her blue coat buttoned neatly, her hat tied securely beneath her chin. Her footsteps were soft against the damp cobblestones as she made her way to the old stone shed. She would open the creaking door, reaching for her large, worn umbrella, its handle smooth from years of careful use. With the umbrella held carefully above her head, she would walk the winding paths of the garden, pausing now and then to brush away bits of fallen petals or gently shake rainwater from the heavier blooms. Her gloved hands would touch the leaves gently, brushing away droplets that gathered too heavily, watching as the water slid off and settled quietly into the soil. Drip, drip, drip. The rain would patter gently against the stones, collecting in tiny streams that wound their way down the paths, curling around the roots of the hedges and slipping between the stones. Mrs. Blossom moved slowly, her shoes tapping lightly against the wet ground, her umbrella swaying slightly with each step. When the rain grew softer, she would close her umbrella shake it out gently, and hang it on the iron hook beside the shed door. She would pick up her watering can, fill it to the brim, and begin her rounds as she always did, pouring the water carefully over the flower beds, watching as it soaked in slowly and completely. The rain would continue to fall, gentle and steady, tapping softly against the glass panes of her cottage windows, filling the bird baths with cool, clear water, and leaving the garden refreshed and bright. Summer arrived quietly, bringing with it long days of sunlight that stretched out across the garden, warming the stones and brightening the petals of the flowers. The hedges grew thicker and greener, the trees fuller and shadier, and the grass grew just a bit softer beneath Mrs. Blossom's feet. She would step out each morning, her soft blue coat replaced by a lighter linen one, her wide-brimmed hat shielding her eyes from the bright morning light. The sunlight spilled through the branches, casting long shadows on the paths, catching on the edges of the flowers and making them glow with soft colour. Mrs. Blossom would walk the path slowly, her hands gliding over the petals as she passed, brushing away bits of dust and smoothing out stray leaves. She would fill her watering can from the stone faucet, the water splashing gently against the sides, and tip the spout over the flower beds, watching as the soil darkened beneath the stream. The sunlight would drift lazily through the garden as she worked, settling on the hedges, warming the stone statues and glimmering on the bird baths. Birds would flit from branch to branch, their songs soft and cheerful, while bees hovered lazily over the blossoms, drifting from flower to flower with gentle purpose. Mrs. Blossom would move with calm precision, never rushing, never hurrying, just the slow, steady rhythm of watering, brushing, and straightening. The sun would climb higher, stretching out across the garden, and Mrs. Blossom would finish her work, nodding with quiet satisfaction before returning her tools to the shed and closing the door softly behind her. Autumn crept in softly, bringing with it a chill that rustled through the leaves and sent soft whispers through the branches. The flowers began to fade, their petals curling gently at the edges, and the hedges grew darker and thicker with the cool air. Mrs. Blossom would step out each morning, her blue coat buttoned up to her chin, her hat tied firmly beneath her neck. She would walk the paths with a soft broom in hand, sweeping the fallen leaves into neat piles. Swish, swish, swish. The leaves would gather easily, their colours bright and crisp, reds and yellows, oranges and browns. She would brush them gently into her wicker basket, her movements slow and careful, her footsteps soft against the cobblestones. The sunlight grew thinner as the days went on, casting long shadows over the winding paths, glimmering through the last of the leaves that clung to the branches. Winter came quietly, covering the garden in a light dusting of snow. lay still and peaceful beneath their white blankets. The stone paths stretched out smooth and untouched, and the hedges stood tall and frosted with delicate crystals. Mrs. Blossom would pull on her thickest coat, her hat lined with fleece, her gloves swapped for heavier ones. She would walk the paths with her snow brush in hand, sweeping the snow away in long, gentle strokes. Her movements were slow and steady, brushing the snow from the tops of the bird paths, clearing it from the stone benches, and sweeping them paths until the cobblestones shone softly in the pale winter light. The air was crisp and still, the garden quiet and calm, and Mrs. Blossom would move through it with perfect peace, her hands gentle, her steps measured. When the snow was swept and the statues were clear, Mrs. Blossom returned to the shed, setting down her brush and lifting a small burlap sack of bird seed from the shelf. She walked slowly along the path, her footsteps soft and steady, and filled each bird feeder with careful hands. The seeds poured out in a gentle stream, rustling softly as they settled into the wooden trays. The birds would come later, small sparrows and winter wrens, flitting softly from branch to branch, chirping quietly as they ate. Mrs. Blossom would watch them sometimes from her window, sipping her tea, her hands folded gently in her lap. Winter continued this way, soft and gentle. The snow would fall quietly, sometimes only a dusting, sometimes thick and heavy, settling over the paths and flower beds. Mrs. Blossom would step out each morning, her coat buttoned and her gloves on, her footsteps even and slow as she cleared the paths, brushed the statues, and filled the feeders. The garden would rest beneath its blanket of white, still and quiet, waiting patiently for the first soft touch of spring. The days drifted by, one after the other, steady and calm, the sunlight stretching long and thin across the frosted stone, catching on the snow and making it shimmer. One morning, as Mrs. Blossom brushed the last bits of snow from the stone path, she noticed the tiniest patch of green pushing up from the frost-covered ground. It was a small sprout, no more than a few inches tall, its leaves curled and bright. She paused, leaning down slowly, brushing her gloved hand over its surface, clearing away the last dusting of snow. She nodded to herself, her eyes soft and bright, and stood back up. Spring was on its way. Spring came softly to the endless garden, tiptoeing in with the first stretch of sunlight and the slow melting of snow. The snow that had blanketed the paths and flower beds began to thin, shrinking away from the edges of the stone and retreating from the roots of the hedges. Tiny patches of green peeked up from the soil, bright and fresh, stretching towards the light. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her stone cottage, her soft blue coat buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied gently beneath her chin. She paused, the top hands folded calmly in front of her, and she took a long, deep breath. The air was cool and crisp, but there was a softness to it now, a gentle warmth that hinted at the promise of spring. Her footsteps were soft against the stone path as she walked toward the old stone shed. The door creaked as she pulled it open, and inside everything was exactly as it should be. The broom, the rake, the shears, all neatly hung and perfectly clean. Her watering cans rested along the far wall, polished and waiting. Mrs. Blossom reached for the smallest of the watering cans, its green surface gleaming faintly in the light. She brushed a bit of dust from the handle, lifted it carefully, and carried it out to the stone faucet beside the shed. She turned the iron handle slowly, listening as the water rushed out in a smooth, steady stream, splashing gently into the can. Mrs. Blossom began with the flower beds along the eastern path, where the first hints of green were pushing up through the soil. Tiny buds, no larger than a pebble, peeked out from beneath the frost. She knelt down carefully, her knees pressing softly into the damp grass, and tipped the spout of the watering can. The water poured out slowly, spreading over the soil, darkening it as it sank in. The tiny buds trembled slightly beneath the gentle weight of the drops, their leaves catching the light and shimmering faintly. Mrs. Blossom moved from one to the next, her hands steady, her movements calm. She watered the roses first, brushing her gloved hand over their tiny stems, smoothing away bits of frost and brushing away stray leaves. Next, she moved to the tulips, their bright green stalks stretching up from the soil, catching the sunlight as she poured water slowly around their roots. The water spilled out softly, soaking into the earth, spreading slowly beneath the surface. Mrs. Blossom would pause after each bed, standing back to admire the tiny blooms as they stretched just a little higher, their leaves unfolding, their petals beginning to peek out from their buds. As the days grew warmer, the trees began to wake as well. The branches, once heavy with frost, now sprouted tiny leaves, soft and bright, stretching out towards the sunlight. Mrs. Blossom would walk the winding paths each morning, pausing to inspect each tree, brushing her hand over the bark, straightening any branches that leaned too far. She carried her small pruning shears with her, snipping away the dead leaves that still clung to the branches, brushing the frost away from the bark, and smoothing out the soil around the roots. Her movements were slow and practiced, her hands gentle and careful. The sunlight stretched longer across the paths, catching the new buds, making them glow with soft light. Mrs. Blossom would pause every now and then, watching the branches sway gently in the breeze, listening to the soft whisper of leaves as they rustled softly against one another. With the warming of the air came the birds, small finches and sparrows, flitting softly from branch to branch, singing their soft songs from the tops of the hedges. Mrs. Blossom roses with gentle hands, watching as they gathered, their wings fluttering lightly as they pecked at the seeds. The soft rains followed soon after, tapping gently on the leaves, pooling quietly in the bird baths, and brushing the dust from the statues that lined the garden paths. Mrs. Blossom would step out with her umbrella, her movements slow and graceful, brushing stray petals from the sea, flower beds, straightening the vines that had begun to climb back up the archways. The water dripped from the edges of the leaves, trickling down the stems and pooling at the roots. The air smelled of fresh earth and wet stone, and the grass grew thicker, stretching up to meet the sunlight as it filtered softly through the branches. By the time spring had fully settled, the garden was bright and lush once more. The roses bloomed along the western path, the tulips stretched tall and proud, and the hedges grew thick and full, their leaves glossy and green. Mrs. Blossom moved through it with calm precision, watering, pruning and brushing away the dust, her hands steady and practiced. Spring had returned fully to the garden, spreading soft light across the flower beds, stretching golden warmth over the stone paths, and bringing with it the gentle hum of bees and the soft rustling of leaves. The hedges were thick and green, the flowers bright and blooming, and the willow trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches brushing the tops of the stone benches. Every afternoon, just as the sunlight reached its longest stretch across the garden, Mrs. Blossom would take a slow walk to the stone table beneath the largest willow tree. The table was smooth and round, carved from pale grey stone, its surface polished by years of sunlight and gentle rain. Around it sat 2 stone chairs, equally worn, their backs curved just enough to make sitting comfortable. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her cottage, her blue coat freshly brushed, her wide-brimmed hat tied gently beneath her chin. In her hands she carried a silver tray, polished and gleaming. On it sat a tea set, an old porcelain teapot painted with tiny blue flowers, 2 matching cups, a small silver spoon, and a jar of honey with a wooden dipper resting neatly beside it. Her footsteps were soft, and even as she walked the winding path, sunlight drifting lazily through the branches above, dust motes floated gently in the light, spiralling up and down in slow, graceful patterns. The birds chirped softly from their branches, their songs quiet and distant. When she reached the stone table, she set the tray down gently, smoothing the linen cloth that covered its surface. She placed the teapot in the centre, the cups to the side, the spoon beside them, and the honey jar just within reach. Everything was exactly as it should be. Mrs. Blossom reached into the small wicker basket she had carried with her and pulled out a neatly folded cloth. Inside was her tea, dried miles of steam. The water darkened as it soaked through the leaves, swirling gently, blending into a rich, warm colour. Mrs. Blossom replaced the lid on the teapot, setting it down gently, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. She sat there quietly, her back straight, her hands resting gently on the cloth of her skirt, watching as the steam rose slowly from the spout. The garden was still and quiet, their only sound the soft rustling of leaves and the distant hum of bees. After a few minutes had passed, Mrs. Blossom reached forward and lifted the teapot with both hands. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her hand steady as she tilted the spout over the first cup. The tea poured out in a gentle stream, the liquid swirling softly as it filled the porcelain. When the first cup was full, she set the pot back on the tray, reaching for the small jar of honey. She lifted the wooden dipper, holding it above the steaming tea, watching as the honey spiraled down in slow golden ribbons. It pooled at the bottom of the cup before swirling gently into the dark liquid. Mrs. Blossom stirred it 3 times, no more, no less, her hand moving the spoon in slow, even circles. The tea shimmered softly, catching the sunlight before settling back into stillness. She set the spoon back on the tray, lifted the cup in both hands, and took her first sip. Mrs. Blossom sipped her tea slowly, her eyes drifting out over the sea garden. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their petals catching the light, glimmering softly as they moved. The hedges stood tall and even, their leaves dark and glossy. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their wings brushing softly against the leaves. She would sit like this for a long time, sipping her tea, watching the garden, her hands resting gently around the cup. Sometimes she would pour herself a second cup, repeating the slow ritual of adding honey and stirring 3 perfect times. Her hands moved with perfect calm, her eyes never hurried, her breath slow and steady. The sunlight would stretch longer as she sat there, inching its way across the stone path, catching the edges of the table and glimmering off the surface of her cup. When her tea was finished, she would fold her hands in her lap, sit for just a moment longer, and then nod to herself. Mrs. Blossom would gather her tea things slowly, one piece at a time. The teapot would be emptied and placed back on the tray, the cups stacked carefully, the honey jar sealed and wiped clean. She would fold the cloth neatly, brushing away stray crumbs, and place everything back in the basket. Her hands were gentle, her movements steady. When everything was in its place, she would stand up, brush off her skirt, and lift the basket carefully in both hands. She would turn back to the path, her footsteps even and slow as she walked back toward the cottage, the sunlight stretching out before her, warm and golden. The stone table would remain beneath the willow tree, its surface smooth and cool, waiting patiently for her to return the next day, just as she always did. As the sun began its slow descent Blossom would step out of her cottage and begin her evening walk through. Her blue coat was buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied securely beneath her chin, and her hands were gloved in soft leather. The air was cool and gentle, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and fresh grass. Her footsteps were soft and measured as she made her way down the main path. The light was golden and warm, filtering softly through the branches of the willow trees that line the walkways. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, spiraling up and down in slow, graceful patterns. Mrs. Blossom carried with her a small wicker basket, empty and light, and a soft cloth draped carefully over her arm. Her eyes moved slowly over the garden, watching the way the sunlight touched the leaves, catching on the edges of the petals, glimmering softly before fading into the shadows. The first task of every evening walk through was straightening the chairs that sat beneath the willow trees. They were made of wrought iron, painted white and polished smooth, their legs resting firmly on the stone tiles. Mrs. Blossom would stop at each one, setting down her basket and brushing her hands along the backs, making sure they were perfectly aligned with the edge of the stone path. The legs would shift ever so slightly as she nudged them into place, her hands steady and practiced. She would brush away any stray leaves that had settled on the seat, smooth the iron armrests with hers cloth, and step back to admire her work. If even the slightest edge was out of line, she would adjust it again, her hands firm but gentle, until everything was just right. When the chairs were straightened, she would move on to the small stone benches that dotted the garden paths. Her hands would glide over the smooth surfaces, wiping away dust and brushing off bits of fallen petals. She would nod quietly to herself as she finished each one, her eyes drifting over the garden with calm approval. Next, Mrs. Blossom would make her way to the flower beds that stretched out along the eastern edge of the garden. The roses, tulips, and daisies stood tall and bright, their petals catching the last light of the sun, glimmering softly in the breeze. She would kneel carefully, her knees pressing gently into the grass, and begin brushing the leaves from the petals. Her hands were slow and gentle, her gloved fingers moving with careful precision. She would lift each flower slightly, brushing away tiny flecks of dust, smoothing out the petals with soft, even strokes. The leaves would float softly to the ground, settling in tiny piles at the base of each stem. Mrs. Blossom would collect them carefully, placing them into her wicker basket, making sure not a single petal was bent or bruised. Her eyes moved slowly over each flower, her hands brushing gently against the leaves, smoothing and straightening with perfect care. When the flower beds were tidy and the chairs were straight, Mrs. Blossom would make her way back to the old stone shed at the edge of the garden. The light would be softer now, spilling through the branches, casting long shadows on the cobblestone inside, placing her wicker basket back in its place, hanging her cloth neatly on its hook. She would run her hand over the handles of the tools that hung along the wall, making sure each one was clean and exactly where it should be. When everything was in order, she would step back, nodding once with quiet approval. She would close the door slowly, listening for the gentle click of the latch, and turn the key softly in the lock. The garden would fall still behind her, the sunlight stretching out in long, thin lines across the flower beds, glimmering on the surface of the bird baths. The birds would settle into the branches, their song soft and distant, blending with the whisper of the breeze as it moved through the hedges. Mrs. Blossom would stand for a moment at the end of the path, her eyes drifting over the garden, watching the last light of the sun fade softly behind the trees. Everything was in its place. The chairs were straight, the flower beds were brushed and clean, and the paths were clear and neat. She would nod once, brush off her gloves, and walk slowly back to her cottage, her footsteps even and steady. The door would close behind her with a soft click, and the garden would remain still and quiet, waiting patiently for the dawn to come again. The sun stretched softly across the stone paths, spilling gentle light over the garden as the morning began. The air was cool and still, the sky a pale shade of blue, dotted with soft clouds that drifted slowly overhead. The hedges were bright and green, their leaves freshly dusted from the morning's watering, and the flower beds shimmered with tiny droplets of dew. Mrs. Blossom stepped out of her little stone cottage, her soft blue coat buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied gently beneath her chin. Her hands were gloved in smooth leather, and she carried with her a wicker basket, empty and light, its handles polished and smooth from years of careful use. Her footsteps were soft and measured as she walked the familiar path to the greenhouse. The stone walkway curved gently around the hedges, lined with tiny white flowers that swayed slightly as she passed. She reached the greenhouse door, its glass panels shining softly in the sunlight, and turned the brass handle with slow, gentle care. The door opened with a soft click, and she stepped inside. The air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of lavender and fresh soil. Rows of potted plants stretched out in neat lines, their leaves soft and bright, catching the light that streamed through the glass panes above. At the far end of the greenhouse stood Mrs. Blossom's sorting table. It was long and smooth, made of polished wood that had been worn gently over the years. In the centre of the table sat a series of small glass jars, each one carefully labelled, in perfect handwriting: daisies, marigolds, tulips, lavender, wildflowers, roses, and more. Mrs. Blossom set her wicker basket down beside the table and reached for the first cloth bundle. It was tied neatly with a piece of twine, its edges folded perfectly, to keep the seeds safe. She untied the string slowly, smoothing it out with her gloved hands before setting it aside. She unfolded the cloth, revealing a small pile of tiny, round seeds. She picked up the glass jar labelled daisies and gently poured the seeds in, listening to the soft tap, 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 as they landed at the bottom. When the cloth was empty, she folded it back up with careful hands, tied the twine around it, and placed it back in her basket. Mrs. Blossom repeated this process for each bundle. Marigolds, tulips, wildflowers, one at a time, slowly and steadily, until each jar was filled. Her hands moved with perfect rhythm, her eyes calm and focused. The seeds settled neatly in the glass jars, lined up perfectly along the edge of the table. The sunlight streamed through the greenhouse windows, catching the edges of the glass, making the seeds glimmer softly. Once the seeds were sorted and labelled, Mrs. Blossom reached for her small wooden scoop and a clean watering can. She stepped carefully to the far side of the greenhouse, where long wooden planters were lined up, their soil smooth and dark. Mrs. Blossom knelt carefully, her knees pressing gently into the cool stone floor. She held the scoop with steady hands, pressing it into the soft soil and turning it over gently, breaking up the clumps, smoothing out the surface. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, spreading the soil evenly, brushing away stray bits of dust and smoothing the surface until it was perfectly flat. She reached for the first glass jar, daisies, unscrewed the lid slowly and held it carefully over the soil. With her fingertips, she lifted the tiny seeds, pressing each one gently into the earth, spacing them perfectly apart. Each seed dropped into its spot, settling neatly in the soil. Mrs. Blossom would pat the dirt gently around each one, smoothing it back into place, brushing away stray bits that had scattered across the edge of the planter. When the seeds were all planted, Mrs. Blossom reached for her watering can, lifting it with both hands. She tipped the spout slowly, watching as the water poured out in a gentle, even stream. The water soaked into the soil, darkening it as it spread out slowly, reaching the roots of each tiny seed. She moved the can carefully along the rows, never spilling, never rushing. Her hands were steady, her eyes calm as she worked. When everything was done, Mrs. Blossom set the watering can back on its shelf, dusted off her gloves, and stood quietly for a moment, looking out over the rows of freshly planted seeds. The sunlight streamed softly through the glass, casting long beams of light over the soil, glimmering off the edges of the jars that lined the table. Everything was neat, everything was calm, everything was exactly as it should be. Mrs. Blossom brushed her hands together, nodded with quiet satisfaction, and closed the greenhouse door softly behind her. The garden stretched out before her, bright and peaceful, waiting patiently for the first signs of green Blossom stepped out of her stone cottage, her soft blue coat buttoned neatly, her wide-brimmed hat tied gently beneath her chin. In her hands she carried a brass spritzer, its surface polished and gleaming, the handle smooth from years of gentle use. Her footsteps were soft, and even as she walked the familiar path, winding around the hedges and past the flower beds, pausing now and then to brush a stray leaf from the edge of a bench. When she reached the greenhouse, she turned the brass handle with slow, careful precision. The door opened with a soft click, and she stepped inside. The air was warm and still, carrying with it the scent of fresh soil and blooming flowers. Light poured through the glass panes above, casting long streams of sunlight over the rows of potted plants that stretched out in neat lines. Before she began her misting, Mrs. Blossom always polished the glass panes of the greenhouse. She walked slowly along the edge of the wall, unfolding a soft cloth she had brought with her, its edges perfectly hemmed. She dipped the cloth into a small basin of water she kept by the corner, wringing it out gently before pressing it to the glass. Her hands moved in slow, steady circles, smoothing away tiny streaks of dust and faint marks left by the rain. The glass cleared with each pass, sunlight spilling through in brighter lines, catching the edges of the leaves and casting soft patterns on the stone floor. Mrs. Blossom moved from pane to pane, her hands calm and unhurried, brushing away the smallest traces of dust until the glass shone with perfect clarity. When she finished with one side, she folded the cloth neatly, dipped it again, and moved to the next, her footsteps soft and measured as she worked. The sunlight stretched further with each pass, warming the leaves, brightening the petals, and filling the greenhouse with soft golden light. When the glass was polished and clear, Mrs. Blossom set down the cloth and lifted the brass spritzer from the table. She held it carefully, pressing the handle slowly, watching as a fine mist sprayed from the nozzle, drifting softly over the leaves. The water settled in tiny droplets, catching the sunlight, glimmering like tiny pearls. Mrs. Blossom moved slowly from pot to pot, misting each plant with the same careful attention. Her hands were steady, her movements smooth and unhurried. She started with the ferns that lined the back of the greenhouse, their leaves wide and green, stretching out beneath the light. The mist curled around the edges of each leaf, catching on the fine hairs, slipping down slowly before gathering in tiny beads. When the ferns were done, she moved to the orchids, their petals smooth and bright, their colours soft and pale. She sprayed each one carefully, her hand moving back and forth, the water settling evenly, darkening the petals with the faintest hint of moisture. Her hands moved steadily, her eyes drifting calmly over each leaf, each stem, each petal. She brushed away stray droplets with her fingertips, smoothing the leaves, adjusting the stems, brushed off her gloves and moved quietly to the rows of pots. She straightened each one with gentle hands, turning them slightly so they caught the light just right. She would press her fingertips into the soil, checking for dryness, smoothing the surface with careful attention. If she found any stray bits of leaf or dust, she would brush them away, wiping her hands gently on the cloth she kept in her coat pocket. The sunlight stretched longer across the stone floor, casting long, dappled shadows over the rows of potted plants. Mrs. Blossom moved from one to the next, adjusting, straightening, brushing and smoothing, her hands gentle and calm. When everything was perfectly misted and neatly arranged, Mrs. Blossom stood quietly for a moment, her eyes drifting slowly over the greenhouse. The glass panes were clear, the leaves were damp with tiny droplets, and the soil was even and smooth. Sunlight streamed in soft lines, catching the edges of each leaf, glimmering faintly before slipping away. The greenhouse door closed with a soft click, and Mrs. Blossom stepped out onto the stone path. The garden stretched out before her, bright and warm beneath the morning sun. The hedges perfectly trimmed, the flower beds brushed clean of stray leaves. Her footsteps were soft and measured as she walked, her hands folded gently in front of her. The path wound gently through the garden, lined with tall hedges and patches of blooming wildflowers. Mrs. Blossom walked slowly, her shoes tapping lightly against the cobblestones. She paused now and then to brush away a stray leaf, smooth out the edge of a flower bed, or adjust a wayward vine that had slipped just slightly out of place. The willow tree stood at the far end of the garden, its long, graceful branches sweeping softly over a small patch of grass. The leaves hung down like delicate green curtains, swaying gently with the breeze, casting dappled shadows on the ground beneath. A stone bench rested beneath its shade, its surface cool and smooth, worn slightly from years of quiet sitting. Mrs. Blossom approached the willow with gentle steps, brushing her hand along its low-hanging branches as she passed. The leaves whispered softly against her gloves, shifting slightly with the movement. She reached the stone bench, set her basket down carefully, and took a seat. Mrs. Blossom reached into her basket and pulled out a bundle of thin reeds, tied together with twine. She untied the knots slowly, her hands moving with perfect patience, and spread the reeds out across her lap. They were smooth and soft, their surfaces polished and even, their edges carefully trimmed. Next, she pulled out a small spool of twine, its fibres thick and strong. She set it beside her on the bench, brushing away the tiniest speck of dust hands moved slowly and steadily, looping the reeds over and under the wooden frame, pressing them into place with gentle care. Her movements were calm and rhythmic, her eyes focused and steady. The reeds bent easily under her hands, curling smoothly as she worked them into place. She would pause every few minutes to adjust the strands, pressing them closer together, making sure they were perfectly aligned. Her fingertips brushed gently along the edges, smoothing out any imperfections, straightening each one until it was just right. When the base was complete, Mrs. Blossom reached for the spool of twine, unwinding it carefully, looping it around the edges of the frame. She pulled it gently, weaving it through the reeds, tightening it just enough to hold everything securely in place. Her hands moved with perfect calm, her breath even and steady. She would pause now and then to inspect her work, running her fingertips along the edges, brushing away stray bits of twine, smoothing out any tiny creases. The willow branches swayed softly above her, their leaves whispering gently in the sea breeze. Sunlight filtered through the gaps, casting long, thin shadows over her hands as she worked. The garden was still and quiet, the air cool and soft beneath the tree's shade. Mrs. Blossom continued her weaving, her hands moving with calm repetition, her eyes focused and steady. When the basket was finally complete, she set it gently beside her on the bench, brushing off her gloves and smoothing out her coat. She would pause for a moment, looking out over the garden, watching the sunlight stretch across the paths, catching the edges of the flowers, making them glimmer softly. The willow branches swayed gently above her, whispering with the breeze, brushing the soft grass beneath them. The sunlight poured through the leaves in long, thin lines, casting dappled shadows that danced softly on the stone paths. Birds flitted quietly from branch to branch, their wings brushing softly against the leaves. Mrs. Blossom sat for a while longer, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes drifting slowly over the garden. Everything was still. Everything was calm. Everything was exactly as it should be. When the light began to soften and the sun dipped low on the horizon, Mrs. Blossom rose from the bench, lifting her freshly woven basket with both hands. She brushed off her gloves once more, straightened her hat, and began her gentle walk back through the garden. Her footsteps were soft and measured as she moved along the winding stone path. She paused every now and then to brush a stray leaf from the edge of a flower bed, straighten the petals of a rose, or nudge a garden chair back into place. Her hands moved with perfect calm, her eyes soft and watchful. The sunlight stretched long and thin, casting gentle glows across the stone statues, glimmering on the surface of the bird baths. The water rippled slightly with the breeze, tiny circles spreading out across the surface, catching the light and shimmering softly before settling back to stillness. Mrs. Blossom paused beside the rose beds, brushing her fingertips gently over the petals, smoothing away a bit of dust that had settled there. She nodded quietly to herself, her hands brushing the leaves, straightening the stems, making sure everything was just right. As the light grew softer, Mrs. Blossom set her basket gently by the garden gate and reached into her coat pocket for her bundle of matches. One by one, she lit each of the glass lanterns that lined the stone paths, striking the match with a soft scritch and watching as the flame flickered to life. The lanterns warmed with soft golden light, casting tiny pools of brightness along the cobblestones. She adjusted the wicks with careful hands, brushing away tiny flecks of dust from the glass, making sure each one shone perfectly. The light spilled out beneath the hedges, stretching over the edges of the flower beds, shimmering against the seesmarsen smooth stone paths. Mrs. Blossom moved slowly from one to the next, her footsteps soft, her hands steady. When she finished, she stepped back and looked out over the garden, watching as the lanterns flickered softly in the fading light. Her last task was always the same. Mrs. Blossom walked to the old stone shed, opened the door slowly, and stepped inside. She set her basket back on its shelf, hung her gloves neatly on their hook, and brushed her hands gently together. She looked around for a moment, nodding to herself as she saw the watering cans neatly stacked. The broom hung perfectly in its place, the shears polished and clean. She stepped back out, closed the door with a soft click, and turned the key in the lock. The evening light grew softer still, stretching long shadows across the garden, catching the edges of the hedges, glimmering faintly on the petals of the flowers. Mrs. Blossom stepped back, smoothing her coat, brushing a stray leaf from her hat, and stood quietly at the edge of the path. Her eyes moved slowly over the garden, watching as the lanterns flickered softly. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the willow branches danced quietly above the stone bench. When everything was just right, Mrs. Blossom turned back toward her cottage, her footsteps light and measured as she moved up the stone steps. The door opened with a soft creak, and she stepped inside, closing it gently behind her with a soft click. The hummus mice from the windows glowed softly against the garden paths, spilling warm light onto the cobblestones before fading slowly away. The lanterns flickered quietly in the breeze, casting gentle shadows, whispering softly as the leaves rustled in the trees. The garden remained still and quiet, resting peacefully beneath the soft glow of the lanterns, waiting patiently for the light of dawn, when Mrs. Blossom would step out once more